Yeah, my name used to be called Sri Sri Ram earlier, and this is the art of happiness. Thanks for coming over. People behind are the happiest lot, and people in the front are sleeping. Right as usual. Continue smiling.
You have a task to wake everyone up.
Information comes from this book. Guys, go ahead and buy this. And this book is, I owe thanks to Roy Singham to have given me inspiration for this. The book is called Happiness, Lessons from a New Science by Richard Layard, who is a LSE economist. Meanwhile,
Just waiting for it.
We all said cheese. We all said cheese when you did.
okay. The end of it. I think people have timed this nicely. The presentation titled Happiness also should be saying lessons from a new science, and this is what it's all about. Quickly, in the next 45 minutes, I'm not sure exactly it'll take 40 minutes or not. It's a rather vast topic, but I'll try and cover it and give some justice. And I must also say that this is probably not fun. It's a lot of serious stuff there. So please don't beat me up. At the end of the day, you don't feel happy. Quickly, we'll do a little introduction and say, look at what is happiness, why happiness matters, and are we happy, are we not happy, and how to be happy. And finally, of course, we all live happily ever after. First, introduction. We'll look at some standard introduction, why this topic came about, and so what is the problem, what is happiness all about. First, Pursuit of Happiness begins year 2001, place Polaris Software Labs in Chennai, where a young man has just joined the company first time after doing an MBA and is sitting in front of Arun Jain and a bunch of people sitting out there. Arun Jain, the CEO, comes and asks everybody, each one after the other, so what do you want to do in life? Why did you join Polaris? Somebody comes and says, I want to be a CEO. Somebody says, I want to change IT, revolutionize IT, whatever, you name it. And there's a young man who comes and says, I want to be happy. And of course, Arun Jain says, of course, money can't buy happiness, not on your salary, but that didn't deter me. Flash forward, year 2010, ThoughtWorks, Roy Singham comes and tells me about Richard Layard. And that young man was Ram Ramalingam. And the pursuit of happiness kind of comes to a logical point here, at which I shall start presenting. The goal, I'm not sure if, can you come a little closer if you're not able to see it, because right here. The goal, the human endeavor has come a long way. First, we started with just survival. And then there was, we started thinking about afterlife and the final reckoning, etc. Then we embraced personal excellence, prosperity, we grew economics, we grew psychology. And finally, in the recent past, the world has come to believe all of this, whatever you did, was just for happiness. So this is just a recounting of the human story. And why now simply says there's this 5 elements to happiness. We always do the philosophy of happiness. That's existed since time immemorial. That is psychology, sociology, which grew as people started analyzing their minds, right, Socrates onwards. Then there's economics and politics came about and money started appearing. Finally, when people started realizing how you can achieve happiness through some kind of a more reliable clinical way, that was the beginning of cognitive science. But all this was a little subjective. What is happiness? Why is happiness important? Until people realized happiness is a very real, measurable scientific phenomenon. Here comes neuroscience. So this topic kind of tries to cover all of these 5 aspects to put the whole thing into perspective. That's it, we don't have a little time. So what's the problem? Are we happy? Global indicators and a few things to look at. First things first, let's open ourselves to reality. This is what a lot of happiness assessments have been happening for the last couple of decades. And since the birth of economics, since the birth of Adam Smith, we started measuring GDP, GNP, whatnot. Recent human development indices and the global satisfaction surveys have come to realize that happiness can be measured, and this is what the global picture looks like. You see the whereas red, people are most happy. This is out of scale of 0 to 10, people rate all over the world what they just think they are in terms of how happy they are, how satisfied they are in life. We'll go on to see meaning of these kind of survey. Does it make sense? Is it consistent across the globe, etc.? But this gives a clear idea. The Western nations are obviously a little more happier. The Scandinavians are the most happiest, and much of Africa is very less happy. The least happy continent is Africa. Asia somewhere in between there.
How come Pakistan is happier than India?
Good question. Good question. We'll answer all those. So here is some more data on this. Okay, that was just a colorful indicator. I mean, it's more very clear, but I'll just explain this to you. What you were measuring is again the SWB, which is the subjective welfare and well-being indicator. Sorry, and on the x-axis is the GDP per capita, which essentially trying to say what is the individual wealth per person and how the countries are faring in terms of happiness. On the right side, you see lots of the richer countries. This is the highest GDP per capita. On the left side is the least GDP per capita. It's very clear here. Whatever nations fall in the bottom of the happiness chart are all ex-communist nations. The Eastern European bloc completely. This is all the Western nations. I mean, top of there is Denmark, Switzerland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway. There is also US there. There's Iceland. The whole lot of Scandinavian nations are the highest happiness out there. The surprising bits are like this. I mean, there are two things that we'll learn from here. One is that there are extremely happy nations despite being poor. And even among the happier, the richer nations, some of them are slightly less happier. Overall, you can see that there is a movement towards happiness as the nations grow richer, but it is not necessary that money can make you happy. That's it. This is just breakdown of the European nations. This will just give you an idea. Most of these surveys actually try to classify things in three terms. Are you very satisfied, fairly satisfied, not very satisfied, not at all satisfied? Sorry, four terms. So this is how the European nations fall out there. And the top is Denmark, who's got I think 70% people are extremely satisfied. Keeps going down. Denmark, Luxembourg, Sweden, Netherlands, Ireland. It's all the Scandinavian countries. There's no France, there's no UK, there's no Italy. We come in the middle of the whole picture. There's Germany somewhere out there. Highest per capita GDP in Europe. Okay, the richest nation out there, US. Since you can't see it clearly there. This data starts at 1957 and goes on to 2005. I don't think I can make this any better. Okay.
Just try one more time function effect. Because it's, I think, dual right now mirror.
That's all right. So 1957 onwards to 2005, this is what the data covers. And this shows again the personal income, this GDP per capita, how it's been growing. Somewhere between $8,000 odd dollars to somewhere around $25,000, $28,000 is what the current level is. GDP per capita has grown to 3.5 times. Happiness is stagnated there. This is a percentage of people who have said they are very satisfied with life. In last 5 decades. So, where are we? I mean, we clearly see, or at least to an extent, statistics clearly shows that happiness is not dependent on money. In fact, I mean, I'll go on to tell you a lot of studies which go and say the limits lies somewhere around $20,000. After that point, per capita, happiness kind of stagnates. There are other factors that really come in to make you happy. I mean, until that point, obviously, the poorer countries, the moment in which the amount of money goes up, they are happier. So once you satisfy the basic needs in life, the other things that come into play. Another interesting thing, so a whole lot of surveys started happening since 1950s, around that time. World Bank started in 1990s. Gallup poll started in 1979. AIPO is the American Association of, I don't know exactly, and since 1946. So a whole lot of people started concentrating on what a more holistic measure of happiness really means. And finally, an interesting thing, in 1972, Jigme Wangchuk, who is the king of Bhutan, he decided, or rather, looked at his economy and realized that what's more important to his country is something called gross national happiness. He kind of formulated that as an alternative to GDP. Bhutan realized it. Of course, they have a Buddhist legacy, and that made them do it ahead of time. Recently, even Thailand has embraced it. It's an official measure which says that I will not measure, apart from the economic things that I'm measuring, I want to measure how happy really people are. Finally, interesting stuff. Here's what the survey done for ThoughtWorks some time back. And what this has is tenure versus how happy people thought they were. This was quoted in I think a couple of months back in one of our surveys. And I mean, I'm not going to draw any conclusions here, just to give you an idea. It goes to show that as tenure kept increasing, the percentage of people who were actually extremely happy slowly went down. I don't know if that's got to do with money going up. Anyways, so coming back to happiness, we looked at what the history behind happiness is and what the various countries are going through in terms of measuring happiness. Let's look at the entire concept of happiness. So here's where the basic foundation lies. Look at the history and philosophy of happiness, some psychology and sociology behind happiness, economics of happiness, and the science of happiness. That's what I promised you initially. We'll break down the whole picture, whole talk into. First things first. Historically, I mean, Aristotle back in 300 BC, around 300 BC, defined something called eudaimonia, which is the ultimate state of happiness. And since then, we've come a long way. In 1740, in the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, somebody called Jeremy Bentham, who was a lawyer and a philosopher and blah blah, he came with a basic idea. He looked at laws from all over the place. The various policies that have been done for the state, they look completely inconsistent. Some of them go after capital punishment, some of them go after some sort of thing. There's no common philosophy behind all the laws. So he tried to collate these laws together, and it's something called a panomion. And he said the common underlying principle behind law should be how happy people are as a result of this. So that gave rise to something called the greatest good for the greatest number of people principle, or he said the policy is good if it does achieve this. So that is Jeremy Bentham, who is the father, so to speak, of what is now referred to as hedonic economics. And after that, economics itself kind of came a long way. Adam Smith started by trying to define wealth of nations in terms of how much you produce. So that, okay, let's come down to Jeremy Bentham was inspired somebody called John Stuart Mill, who he was a parliamentarian, a British guy again. He is the father of something called utilitarianism, and John Stuart Mill went one step beyond Bentham, and he actually looked at the great peoples of those times, and he said, like, obviously the importance of the happiness for a schoolboy is less when compared to Socrates. What Socrates is more important. So he tried to say that happiness has qualities to it, and there are dimensions to it. So he said there's a lower and higher forms of happiness, but you would eventually people. I mean, there is a criticism to it. I'm sorry, a little started here. Somebody coming here. Sorry. So the criticism of this whole thing is that what he's trying to look at in terms of what achieves happiness, for example, poetry versus playing a game of nine pins, is just a source of happiness, not the happiness itself. What it finally gives you is a measure. It's still happiness. So people, agree to what John Stuart Mill said, but later on, the Age of Enlightenment went beyond it. So somebody like Immanuel Kant and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on whom much of the philosophies later on rested for the Declaration of Rights of Man, which is the French Revolution's final document, and the American Declaration of Independence. Okay, so it's not like there are no types of happiness. There are obviously types of happiness. It's not that there's only one dimension. So eventually you will see that there are two forms of happiness, the aroused and the unaroused form, which is to say that the same happiness you can have in an active fashion or inactive fashion. So that's what philosophy has finally come to agree to. So there are two dimensions: you are happy or unhappy, or you're aroused and unaroused. If you're happy and aroused, you're like joyous. If you're happy and just unaroused, you're just content. So far, so good. I effectively managed to take the smile out of everybody's faces. So this is what the result had, the Grand Declaration of Independence. This is the American Declaration of Independence, and the most important part lies here. It says, even now it's not very clear, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Back then, people realized already two most important things. That this truth is self-evident. It's an unalienable right for you to pursue happiness. I think at this point in time we should be pretty clear. Happiness is important. That's probably the end objective of the whole thing. And if you actually go back and think about it, everything else you do and all other goals will eventually boil down to it. So that's the history and philosophy of it. And let's look at the sociology and the psychology of it. Yeah, there's lots of stuff since Sigmund Freud did, and this is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So this is the beginning of motivational theory, and so what it really says is that this is basically need-based psychology, which says man tries to achieve his basic needs, and the second next step to Freud. Basically, there are physiological needs: breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, excretion. It's like this is the most fundamental needs. And the next is safety, security, body, employment, resources. Then there's love, belonging. You're looking at social thing, and esteem in terms of what your self-respect is and what others respect you. And finally, something called self-actualization. So Maslow's theory was that to be able to get to the next level, you should have satisfied the basic needs. You don't go to the higher levels of the needs until you satisfy the more basic ones. So this, for a long time, was considered as a perfect model of how people behave. I mean, some people seem to be so caught up on money or basic things, and the philosophers obviously went beyond it. And people used to, I mean, that actually was consistent with the other beliefs of John Stuart Mill, etc. And people thought there are various forms, levels of needs, and you have to actually get over one to the other. But the funny thing is, actually, Abraham Maslow, who we studied, was people like Einstein, Jane Addams, Roosevelt, etc. I mean, his samples was extremely biased, to say the least. And a couple of other criticisms to it. One is that it's culturally not sensitive. He obviously looked at only on one side of people there. And second, it's that needs are actually not non-hierarchical. It's not necessary. Some people actually, even before you get your physical needs, can go to the next level. I mean, whatever. You name your philosophers of your... so basically, culture. Some cultures are individualistic, some are socialistic. The social cultures actually don't look at the physical needs, they move towards other needs. So the Hofstede was one guy who kind of criticized it heavily. So what next was something called Max Neef's fundamental human needs is now more accepted. He did not just say there's a hierarchy of needs, there's an order of importance. He classified needs into multiple dimensions. And let me just read it out here. There's freedom, identity, creation, leisure, participation, understanding, affection, protection, subsistence. Some of them are physical, some of them are individualistic, some of them are socialistic. All kinds of needs. Those are the fundamental human needs. And you can either the form in which the need take existence is by either being or having or doing or interacting. Any of them can lead to it. So there are whole lots of needs out there. And this is actually the fundamental basis behind which most of your human development index is based, where you measure happiness through multiple factors. And these are the needs that eventually get taken into account for the Human Development Index. So this more holistic concept, both was supposed to be culturally neutral, and it's consistent across all economic segments and all sections of people. So this is psychology of economics, psychology of happiness. Next, let's just look at economics history of happiness. Since Adam Smith formulated the free market and the invisible hand theory, it led to the capitalism. People have been measuring progress of people, nation, society in terms of how much you produce. So this is what, again, Adam Smith's presentation says. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard of their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantage. Basically, the idea is this: everybody follows their own selfish best. You're going to achieve the social best. I mean, this is the basics behind capitalism. And that led, of course, consumerism. The more you produce, the more you consume, and it's a self-fueling need. That was classical economics, where product of a nation and purchasing power was of maximum importance. value of money is same to everyone. That's something earlier talk, Amit, you talked about. Value of money is assumed to be same for everybody. The cost-benefit analysis, fundamental to the economic equation, assumes that the dollar value you give for every single activity is same for everybody. For example, if there's a bridge being built over a slum, somebody's getting displaced. The benefit of it, you will say, is that somebody's driving distance goes down. That's the dollar benefit for the person who's gaining out of it. And the cost is who are getting displaced out there, or somebody's having noise pollution. That's the cost of the entire economic equation. So you say cost equals benefit, the difference is positive, well, that makes economic sense for you to build the bridge. But is the person who is actually going to be affected being paid this money? The money never transfers. The benefit is already accrued. Money never transfers, the person is actually getting affected. So the dollar value of the actual economic good never is not equal to the person on both sides of the equation. So the classical economics fails in a lot of ways. So GNP, GDP, PPP, unfortunately, these measures are temporary utility of resources. They are not a permanent thing that cannot be measured. It does not translate over time. Finally, people believe that taxes are distorting. And somebody called B.F. Skinner is famous for the beginning of something called behaviorism. He went on to say that people's behavior can, basically your actions cannot be measured in terms of what your actual motives are. Motives are not measurable. So you have to just look at the behavior, not what the motive of a person is. Perfect market. So Adam Smith says market is perfect, but market is a perfect market means it's a free market. Anybody can enter it. Anybody can get out of it. There's no cost of entry and exit, and but everybody's equal. Everybody got equal information. And whatever, for example, the earlier bridge example we gave, only the parties involved you are considering, and all the parties involved are being considered when you are doing the benefit cost analysis and seeing if it makes sense or not. But the real market is not free. It's not equal. Not everybody has equal information. And there are externalities. Every single act of yours is going to affect some people you never take into account. So, finally, loss aversion and inconsistent behavior are the final things that nails the coffin on classical economics. Classical economics assumes that the cost of gaining something is same as the cost of loss. It's not. People have proven that loss aversion is twice as costly as gain. Simple. I think I should spoil the surprise for later. So change can be bad. People do not want to change. There are costs to all these things, and these are not considered in classical economics. So this is the birth of happiness economics. 1974, Richard Easterlin presented a paper called "Does Economic Growth Improve the Human Lot?" It's an empirical evidence. The country data you saw, where you had the richness of countries was happiness, that was the birth of Richard Easterlin. This is called the Easterlin paradox, where he went on to prove that money does not create happiness. Since then, Amartya Sen have, a lot of people have argued on developmental economics, but they go on to say money should be there where it's really needed. Not in, basically, if the resources is not allocated to the right section of population, you're not creating maximum happiness. So extra dollar gives more happiness to the poor. Taxation and redistribution is actually good, but not complete equality. So this is the concept, right? By providing incentive for production, the whole concept of measuring GNP, GDP, you are actually creating incentive in the right places. If you tax and give it to redistribute to the poor does not have the incentive to get better, and nor is the person who's actually producing getting the incentive to produce a lot. So he went on to say it's not that taxation is the best thing to do, but at a certain point, creating equality has its benefit, but taxation creates a reduction of the pie by reducing the incentive for production. So when your benefit from redistribution goes less than this decrease in pie, you stop redistribution. It's not you start redistributing to the point everybody is equal. So finally, so we have recent development and Human Development Index, beginning of welfare economics, well-being index, and gross national happiness. That was the economics of happiness. Any questions? Sorry, a quick feedback. This is running really fast. Does this make sense? I can probably change it a little bit. Right? Alright, typically on the last bit, the science and neuroscience of it. Until now, everything is just subjective. I just told you happiness is important. I just give you some statistics and saying that happiness is going up or going down. It doesn't make any sense as long as how do you measure happiness? So until recently, it was not possible for people to know if people are really telling the truth that I'm saying I'm extremely happy or extremely sad, which is a temporal feeling. Yesterday I had an ice cream, so I felt happy now. Yesterday my girlfriend said she loves me, so I'm happy. No, it's not. Is it really true? So yeah, development of fMRI and a lot of scientific techniques have told, have made people realize that happiness can be measured. So the more happy thoughts are experienced in the left prefrontal lobe, where you see it there. And this is the experiment that kind of famously did it. Not very clear, yeah, I'm sorry, it's a photo I took from the book. So there's a happy baby face and a sad baby face. So the mothers were asked, presented this picture, and what you don't see here is a brain scan where a happy picture is producing a left side, lights are glowing up there, and on a sad, you can see some bit of a glow there. So right sides are lighting up when you're seeing a sad face. So happy thoughts have a specific region that gets activated, and sad thoughts do it on the right side. So this actually was also noticed that babies who are much more happy and smile a lot, it's not just adults who behave the same, babies have the same kind of reactions, and the babies that cry a lot actually have the right side more active. And in fact, some of them who have a damage of the brain on the right side have a lifelong happiness. The right side is permanently deactivated. Very funny. Next thing is this, that we already discussed, happiness has various types to it, and there are a couple of dimensions, and it's not like happiness from one source is exactly equal to some other happiness. But the good news there, happiness is additive. It's something like the hotness of chilies. I'm pretty sure Indians would know there are various kind of hotness. Chili in Andhra Pradesh tastes different from chili in West Bengal. But still, there is a unifying something called Scoville scale, right? Which measures the hotness. So some things that can be added over and measured in the common scale. So what is happiness? Is absence of misery happiness? Is it a one continuous scale from one end is misery, other side happiness? It's not really so. It seems that your unhappy thoughts on a different part of the brain and your happy thoughts on a different part of the brain. So in order to increase happiness, it's not just that you be happy, you actually have to reduce your unhappiness too. So you reduce the misery, increase happiness. Both are extremely important for you to be in a consistent state. So is it a vague subjective feeling? Is it can be measured? Science gave the answer to it. It's not vague subjective. Studies have been done. People actually are very truthful or predominantly truthful when they say they are happy, and it correlates with the way their fMRIs scans pan out. Awesome. So happiness is important. Money does not necessarily lead to happiness, and people can be studied for their happiness, so you can take conclusions out of the whole science. What is happiness is very clear. So why happiness? Why are we not happy? So we already saw, at least philosophically, people have argued. For heaven's sake, the American Declaration of Independence says so. It's self-evident happiness is extremely important. And why are we happy or why are we not happy, or why is happiness important? So, first question. So this is a study which one of the studies that Easterlin did for, I'm not sure if you quoted this in your loss aversion thing. So Harvard people were studied on two choices. And everyone, if you had a choice of earning $50 while everybody else earned $25, this is one world you are living in. Second world is that you are earning $100 and everybody else is earning $250. What would your choice be? The Harvard graduate said, I want the world one. I'd rather that I have less. I mean, I'm earning only $3 as long as others are earning only $25. If others are earning $250, I would actually want to, earn much more. I don't care if I'm earning $100 or not. The funny part, another experiment. In World 1, you have 2 weeks of vacation. Others have only 1 week. And in World 2, you have 4 weeks of vacation. Others are 8 weeks. People actually prefer the second world. Only 20% prefer the first world. So it's a pretty funny thing. We really care for relative grading. Happiness is not absolute. It's not determinant on what just you are doing. It's determinant on what others are doing too. And people really care only about their earning, not so much about others' leisure. Even if others are more leisured, it's okay. As long as I am more leisured, it's fine. It's an interesting concept. So two major takeaways there. Money matters in respect to others, but your happiness matters for yourself. No, awesome idea here. A survey across all Olympic medalists were conducted and found it, and as expected, you would think the gold medalists are most happy. Who's the next most happiest? It's actually the bronze medalists. Silver medalists are very unhappy. You know why?
We lost the gold.
Exactly. The bronze medalists have somebody who's got nothing to compare to. The bronze medalists, the silver medalists are thinking, yeah, somebody's got a gold. Bronze, okay, I may not have gotten it. But he's comparing himself with gold more than somebody who's below. So studies goes to show that when somebody earns you $1, if you earn $1 more, if X was your happiness you gain, and if somebody earned $1 more than you, your happiness goes down by 1/3 of what your happiness went up by earlier. So economics again faltered. The economics assume that if everybody salary being equal, you got $1 more, the whole happiness is gone up. It's the whole concept of GDP. But actually, if you earn $1 more, everybody else is unhappy. There's also an example. East Germany, before unification, their happiness index something like 6 point something. A few months after unification, it's come down to 4 point something. Why? Because they're comparing now with the West Germans. So basically, this is what Easterlin's paradox is all about. He said you put that after around $28,000, happiness is pretty much not correlated with salary, with income. That's one reason why happiness is not gone up despite money going up. Second reason, adaptation. It's being compared to something called hedonic treadmill. So you keep 5 more minutes. All right. So or classically it's called the Red Queen sprint in the Alice in Wonderland world, where you just keep running and you still have the same amount of pleasure. You're just not going anywhere. As people get used to the source of happiness, what you used to be happy about when you're a kid, I'm sure you're no longer happy with. The same thing as alcohol or drugs. It's kind of addiction factor to it. After a point, your utility from the same goods goes down. Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, I could not even afford a geometry box. I was extremely happy after like a few months later, my father saved up money to buy me one. Now I keep changing cell phone every month. So, sorry, the last thing important there. What's already also seen is that there are some sources of happiness which never go down. Some things you get addicted to, but some things you don't, like friendship or love. So that's an important thing we'll look at later on. So now that we see that we are, as human beings, love happiness, why haven't we evolutionarily adapted to it? That's because there is a factor of anxiety that's important for evolution, and that gives you the feedback for learning, and that's essential for you are actually programmed to feel anxious. So it's actually shown that your bitterness, the taste buds, is 3 times more sensitive than the sweetness factor. It's kind of like your genes are saying that it needs to be more aware of what can go wrong. So paranoia is essential. Finally, TV. Finally, TV. Bhutan had an awesome idea for measuring GNH. What it did wrong, however, in 1999 is legitimized TV. The happiness dropped. So why is that so? It's very palpably evident that violence and sleep, etc., changes the way you perceive things. Comparative influence goes up after looking at it. It's a proven fact. A lot of research has been done on it. That people when they start seeing programs about rich and famous, next thing they know, they would think that their own incomes are much lesser. Same thing with beauty. When people are shown a lot of videos of beautiful women, next day they ask, how beautiful do you think your wife is? Score drop. Sorry.
Education is bad, right?
Wrong factors. Basically, television is supposed to distort reality. That's the only thing. So here's where we are. Knowing that happiness is important, knowing that we are not necessarily getting happier, and knowing that these are the factors that make you happy, what do you do? So this is what the top factors that contribute to happiness is where, I mean, after a lot of research, when they realize money is not all that important, they realize what is actually important is family life is the top. Second is financial situation. I mean, it's not just money, the entire situation. What are you capable of achieving through your money? Third is job and work, and fourth is community and friends. Fifth is health. Sixth is personal freedom. Seventh is personal values. Here is a beta coefficient which tells you what the correlation factors were with happiness. So that's a decreasing order of it. And these are top 7 factors out there. And surprisingly, what didn't matter is something like age. It seems like people who are happy remain happy. I mean, everything else being the same. It's not like people get any happier or less happier. Things on gender doesn't matter. But yeah, there's been a slight skew. Women are more happy than men, but it's very small skew to be noticeable. And looks, IQ, all these things, and people assume that these things can make a difference. It does not. Also, education, strangely, it seems to make people a little more happier only for the reason that they sometimes are able to earn more money where they are actually poor. In the poorer circles, the more educated are more happier. Yeah, this is research from Easterlin and Kelton and Hauke. Yeah, there's lots of data out there. At any point in time, later you want these researches, I can pass it on to you. So those are the factors that really contribute to happiness. And almost 80% of the total happiness variation are determined by these sub-factors. These are just breakdown of the existing factors. First is the divorce rate. In the family life, the most important thing was the divorce rate. Most of this data is kind of Western world dominated, but some of them you will see that have a great correlation with us too. Second is unemployment rate. People are really loss averse. People really care about having a job security. Third is level of trust. Your community and friendship we talked about. The level of trust is the single most important thing that determines the happiness. And all these parameters were highest in the Scandinavian countries. 64% was the score of people in Norway who said that they can pretty much trust everybody, and the bottom was only 5%, I think, in one of the Eastern European countries. Number 4 is membership in non-religious organizations. Number 5 is quality of government. People in the communist world were clearly the most unhappiest. So these, and finally the fraction who believe in God, or actually questions were put in such a way, in asking, do you believe in a higher purpose or believe in God? So that is the 6th highest factor. These 6 factors contributed to 80% correlation to happiness. So, those are the things that make us happy. Can we pursue the common good? This is a classic study, the 2 mules where you have grass on one side and the grass on the other side. The 2 mules are tied to each other. They can neither of them get the grass, but if they cooperate, yes, that's a classic prisoner's dilemma happening, that if you cooperate, you win. But can we cooperate? Yes, it's shown that if there is sufficient, the game theory is used to do repeated interactions. In a single interaction, yes, people do not cooperate, they always fight, they compete. But if there is a question of repetition that comes into place, people do cooperate eventually. And we evolved as pack hunters. We are individually people who care for survival, but man learned to cooperate and hunt together. So punishment and approval also matters. It's shown that enforcement improves cooperation. So we also seek approval, and sociability is extremely important. That's it. So it's kind of a moot point, and it's hardly worth arguing. What's more interesting out there is the third, is sense of fairness. Children want everything to start with, but they start by saying it's mine, and slowly they still learn to cooperate and share things. So what's observed is that conscientiousness is like 40% genetic, which is like trying to say that parents who have taught, who learn to be conscientious, actually pass this on to the children in a genetic way. So the interesting thing is not just that people are born conscientious, but also children do adapt over a period of time. So that adaptation is done by creating a right approval system and creating a situation where you are repeating the game, basically the contest situation multiple times. So over a period of time, people are encouraged to behave well. Finally, fourth is commitment. It's a funny experiment again. People are asked, if you were given $100 today and $101 tomorrow, what would you prefer? Everybody prefers $100 today. Same question is worded. If you were given $100 next week, but given $101 4 weeks later, people don't mind. Let's say, I don't know. Yeah, so people say that next week or 4 weeks later is not a big deal for me. I'd rather wait and get $104. The idea being that if people have learned, taught to be committed, they don't mind actually. Basically, there is immediate gratification is the most important need for you. But if you are taught to be committed, you actually gain more. And finally, tribalism. It's an interesting story in which a bunch of school kids who studied in the same school were taken to a camp together, and they were happily playing as like awesome cooperation happening between them, a good bonhomie. And the moment they divided into 2 camps, fight breaks out. You say the camp A and camp B, they kept fighting forever, and they could not agree on anything after a point. Finally, something went wrong, the bus broke down, and everybody had to come together and solve the issue. Next thing you know, they all wanted to go back in the bus together. Cooperation is improved by tribalism, and basically common challenges really help it. Lots of stuff there. I'm going to kind of summarize it. I think we're running out of time here. Okay, what we have here is this. So we pretty much know that creating competition is inimical to happiness, but people are inherently competitive. So what do you do to decrease competitiveness? So first things people say is that the reason why people are competitive is because you are trying to measure one against the other. So get rid of ranking. Yes, encourage excellence. Give competition. Competition creates tribalism. People who cooperate together to achieve something better. People evolve better by challenges. But the moment you create ranking, you're causing more negative factors than positive factors. So how do you ensure that people still don't go ahead and do like what Americans are doing? Why is consumerism? How can you discourage consumerism? Is by taxation. Taxation was earlier thought of as something that's distorting the economy, but it actually corrects things by redistributing in the right place. So in the corporate setup, what do? How do you ensure the policy is tuned towards making people more cooperative and decreasing competition? Increase work-life balance. I'm going to totally out of time here, sorry. Run through what does a summary is.
If people are interested, then you can continue in
No,
open
open
space.
exactly. what
That's a
is
good
said.
idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That would be
So
a
you can put
fantastic
up a
open
topic
space
if
topic.
people want to discuss out there. I think you can continue in open space. There's
All right.
other sessions, so we have lightning talks and all that. Everything will get delayed further.
Absolutely done. So,
Sorry about that.
no worries, man.
I think this would make a great open space topic because there's so much.
Take away.
Yeah.
On this note, I will take questions later.